Chapter 18 of John Hancock, The Picturesque Patriot by Lorenzo Sears. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Treasurer of Harvard College. In the diminution of his fortune and the increased outlay incident to the chief magistracy of Massachusetts, Hancock wrote, on September 24, 1781, to Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, with regard to reimbursement for outlays attending his presidency of Congress. Pray, my friend, when will be the properest time for me to be considered for my expenses while President of Congress? They wrote me on the subject some 2 years ago, but I waived troubling them, knowing the delicacy of their situation. Indeed, I kept no account of my expenses, nor had I time for it, as you well know how my time was engrossed, and the labors and fatigue I underwent, and the expenses I must have necessarily incurred. I can speak plain to you. Confident I am that £1,500 sterling would not amount to the expenses I incurred as president. In this I think I merit consideration, more especially as grants have been made to all my successors. It is not known that he ever received compensation for his labors during the 2.5 years of his service as President of the Continental Congress. It will do no harm to keep this in mind, and particularly his statement that he kept no account of his expenses in the engrossment of his time amidst the labor and fatigue of his office, since what has been regarded as a sad dereliction in a place of trust must not be passed over as an instance of undertaking too many responsibilities at once. This may be an explanation, but it cannot serve as a justification of a course pursued for years, which a resignation of the treasurership of Harvard College would have made impossible. As far back as 1773, in fulfilling the liberal intention of his Uncle Thomas, and by adding something of his own, Hancock had gained the credit of being a generous benefactor to the college. The most popular man in the province, wealthy, liberal, and patriotic, he was considered as a most desirable person to be connected with the monetary affairs of the institution. Its funds would be secured by his ample fortune. His integrity was undoubted. But soon after his election, it was discovered that these qualifications were not all that were required in a college treasurer at that time. Attention to business and keeping accounts in such order that the condition of the treasury could be known on demand were found to be of more consequence than personal riches and popularity. Neglect of those unpretentious virtues was as perilous as dishonesty. It was unfortunate for Harvard that the patriotism of its treasurer diverted his attention from its financial affairs to the larger sphere of congressional business. His own business was slack enough in the days of the Port Bill and the siege, but when he was elected President of Congress, the concerns of the college doubtless seemed remote and inferior to those of the country at large, with its legislation and warfare. Accounting for funds and paying salaries of college professors was a petty occupation compared with official correspondence and presiding over a Congress which represented the whole country. He could have easily thrown off the lesser responsibility, and the college stood ready to concur in a year after his appointment. His first mistake was in not disencumbering himself of this burden. That he did not do this was not for the lack of hints and requests. At an early day, President Langdon, who had been elected by the corporation at a meeting held at Hancock's house, wrote him urging the importance of an immediate statement and settlement. No answer was received to this suggestion. 2 months later, another appeal was sent with the same result. A third letter couched in the most considerate terms and entreating a reply elicited the information that Mr. Hancock is busily engaged and will soon appoint a day to attend to the business. Not appearing on the day appointed, he postponed the matter to the next week, when he did not arrive. Another entreated to settle before he should leave town, and to leave his accounts with college authorities, called out no reply. Then they voted that Colonel Hancock be requested to deliver moneys, bonds, and other papers belonging to the college treasury into the hands of the president or of others specified, and take a receipt for the same. A messenger took this request, and Hancock could not escape returning something. It was the following letter. Mr. Hancock presents his compliments to the Reverend President and the other gentlemen who were present yesterday at the meeting, and acquaints them that he has at heart the interest of the college as much as anyone, and will pursue it. He is much surprised and astonished at the contents of the President's letter, as well as at the doings of the gentlemen present, which he very seriously resents. And however great the gentleman may think the burden upon his mind may be, Mr. Hancock is not disposed to look upon it in that light, nor shall the college suffer any detriment in his absence, as he has already determined those matters. But if the gentlemen choose to make him a public choice of a gentleman to the displacing him, they will please act their pleasure. Mr. Hancock writes in a very great hurry, being much engaged, but shall write very particularly, or be at Cambridge in person as soon as the Congress rises. He leaves all his matters in the hands of a gentleman of approved integrity during his absence, which he is not disposed to alter, and peradventure his absence may not be longer than a voyage to Machias. Concord, 3:00 p.m., 11 April, 1775. In 10 days he started for Philadelphia, and the corporation was silenced for 3/4 of a year, but they appointed the president receiver of rents from their real estate, of legacies and donations, and of the Charlestown ferry earnings, the treasurer having been long absent and there being no expectation of his speedy return. Conditions becoming insupportable by March, 1776, another supplicatory letter, begging a moment's attention, reluctant to interrupt Mr. Hancock, engaged in momentous affairs on which the salvation of the United Colonies depends, just to mention the difficulties of the Seminary of Learning. It was a humble and pitiful statement of ruin, defacement by troops, dispersion of students, with no income available, and no treasurer to receive what little could be collected. No answer was received. Another month and another letter. Lame apologies were returned in 3 weeks, with the information that Mr. Hancock had sent a messenger to Boston to bring all the books and papers across the country to Philadelphia for his arrangement. By a shrewd suggestion, he placed the responsibility of requesting his resignation upon the college. With many obeisances, they tried to throw this upon his sense of duty to the college and the country, with the possibility of reconciling both, intimating as plainly as they dared their wish that he would resign. After 3 months a committee was appointed, which in a week evolved another letter that in 7 weeks drew a reply, which left them to consider further what to do with the evasive treasurer. They sent Tudor Hall to Philadelphia for the college papers. 2 months afterward these were in the corporation's possession, with bonds and other obligations amounting to £1,600. Then they were bold enough to vote, after a complimentary preamble, that it was highly expedient that another treasurer who shall consistently reside within the state be elected in the stead or in the place of Mr. Hancock. But they were too timid to elect another until he should resign. 3 meetings were held to prepare an answer to a letter which Hall brought with the securities. This reply consisted of 28 pages of justification of the corporation's action. Hancock took no notice of it or their vote. After 3 months more of waiting, the authorities proceeded to elect Ebenezer Storer, Esquire, in the room of the Honorable John Hancock, who regarded this action as a personal affront and never forgave the corporation. To conciliate him, they entreated him to present his portrait, to be drawn at the expense of the corporation and placed in the philosophy chamber by that of his honorable uncle. He took no notice of this compliment. He might have vanity in abundance, but it had been wounded too severely to rise to that lure. He had, moreover, a cash balance in his hands. After much soliciting by another committee to no purpose, it was voted to enter suit against the late treasurer of Harvard College. The authorities hesitated and postponed action, and finally rescinded their vote. The college feared that the legislature, in which Hancock's influence was predominant and his popularity undiminished. Another appeal was unnoticed. Then came his election as governor after these years of solicitation disregarded. In his inaugural address, as has been mentioned, he warmly commended Harvard College to the care and patronage of the legislature, and the corporation manifested their gratitude by expressing their happiness that a gentleman is placed at the head of the general court and of the overseers, who has given such substantial evidence of his love of letters and affection by the college, which the generous and repeated benefactions which now he hath endowed it. Honors were even now, but when as ex officio chairman of the board of overseers he took his seat, he made no answer to their mention that his accounts were still unsettled, nor to the repetition of it once and again. So requests and silences succeeded one another through 5 terms of governorship, until in his last one, when, giving notice of his intention to resign, he finally made a statement of his accounts, which he had withheld nearly 11 years from the first request by the corporation in 1774. It then appeared that there was due from him to the college a balance of £1,054, but no payment was made. 2 years afterward, a letter was sent to him saying that the university could not subsist without receiving its interest money. He replied enigmatically, "It is very well." More letters elicited promises to pay in a week, with repeated postponements and failures to pay. The last promise was for January 1793 to be unfulfilled. In October of that year he died, leaving the debt unpaid. 2 years later, his heirs paid 9 years' interest on the account, and in the course of 6 or 7 years completed payment of the principal, but refused to pay compound interest, whereby the college lost upwards of $526. The following letter is of interest as showing the efforts to restore friendly relations. Boston, October 20th, 1783. Reverend Sir, however illiberal the treatment I have met with from some of the former and present governors of the college has been, it shall never operate in my mind to the prejudice of the University at Cambridge. I most sincerely wish its enlargement. The present appearance of those buildings is very disagreeable for want of a reputable enclosure. They must appear to a stranger as buildings totally neglected and deserted, instead of being improved for the noble purposes they are now occupied. I wish to remedy this inconvenience, and have to request, if worthy your notice, that you would be pleased to give orders to your college corporation to erect a respectable fence around these buildings, such as one as shall not disgrace the buildings, and such an one as shall be pointed out to them by yourself and Dr. Cooper, whose instructions they are to follow, and upon your signifying the corporation of the business and transmitting to me the bill of its amount, it shall meet with immediate payment. My best wishes for your prosperity and that of the university under your charge concludes me, Reverend Sir, your very humble servant, John Hancock. Reverend Mr. President Willard. To this offer President Willard replied 3 months later, referring the whole matter of the fence to Governor Hancock, to direct everything agreeably to his taste, which I am confident will strike the taste of every judge of architecture. 2 years later, President Willard explained at length that he did not intend to treat the governor with disrespect in assigning him a seat on the occasion of the dinner in honor of Marquis de Lafayette, who was seated below the president on the same bench, the 3rd place, and your excellency directly opposite, the 2nd place. Cordial understanding appears to have been restored by 1791, when President Willard returns his most respectful compliments to His Excellency the Governor, with his best thanks for his very generous and acceptable present of Madeira and a quarter cask of sherry wine and 2 large loaves of sugar. The President wishes it was in his power more fully to express his feelings of gratitude to the Governor for his munificence and kindness. At a distance of 119 years from its close, the whole transaction looks like an instance of financial irregularity through absence, and pressure of more important affairs, with continued postponement of an evil day of settlement. That there was premeditated purpose to use the funds of the college, or if used, never to repay them, would be the worst interpretation that can be put upon the attitude of Governor Hancock towards his alma mater. After reading President Josiah Quincy's detailed account in his History of Harvard College of the long negotiation of which a brief abstract has been given above, it seems uncharitable to insist that fraud was intended. But Hancock's gross inattention to a trust that had been committed to him, coupled with an uncivil neglect to reply to most courteous requests for information, and finally for relief by transfer of the office to another, is beyond apology and without excuse, although a partial explanation may be found in his undertaking too much business and in the willingness to hold too many offices and a reluctance to surrender any one of accumulated honors. Still, the explanation does not contain the essential elements of an excuse or even an apology. There is, however, one circumstance in this chapter of Hancock's history that is so unaccountable that it cannot be passed over without mention. The writer of 10 letters of detraction over the signature of Laco in the year 1789 for some reason failed to take up the most important and damaging charge that he might have used against the re-election of Hancock that year. He accused him of vanity, caprice, extravagance, social dissipation, pliancy, timidity, lack of statesmanship, favoritism, abuse of the prerogative, and other faults which had their value in a campaign document, but not a word about his delinquencies as treasurer of Harvard. Such silence is almost equivalent to an enemy's praise. So also Governor Hutchinson, who could not be expected to favor Hancock, defended him before the king, who had received impressions of financial irregularity among other evil reports about the arch-rebel. And if Samuel Adams had been disposed to make capital out of Hancock's delinquency, as he was not, there was a restraining paragraph in the town records reading, "We also find that there still remains to be paid into the province treasury on account of Mr. Samuel Adams the sum of £50, and from the information given us by Mr. Robert Pierpont, it appears that there is no probability that any part of the sum of £1,149, or remaining unpaid of Mr. Adams's debt to the town, will ever be received and paid into the treasury." Thomas Cushing, Esquire, and John Ruddock, Esquire, also owed £155 and £82 respectively on account of a lottery authorized by the General Court. Perhaps the quantity of glass in some houses did not encourage stone-throwing at Hancock. In any case, Harvard misdemeanors do not appear to have affected his popularity with the people of Massachusetts, who continued to elect him as their chief magistrate year after year. It is also probable that the college, knowing its dependence upon the General Court, and having a prudent sense of the governor's influence with that body, kept as quiet about his mismanagement as circumstances would permit. There was a final interchange of compliments when, at the installation of President Willard, Governor Hancock called the college, in some sense, the parent and nurse of the late happy Revolution, and the corporation termed him an affectionate and liberal son. To which the historian of this affair adds that Hancock's polished manners, wealth, and liberality and patriotism had rendered him the most popular man in the province. Some, however, have not yet forgiven him after 119 years, and much of existing prejudice against him can be attributed to this unfortunate part of his career. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of John Hancock, The Picturesque Patriot by Lorenzo Sears. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Last years. While Governor Hancock magnified his office and the rights of a state which had been foremost in the Revolution, and sometimes betrayed a lurking fear that the general government might assume undue power, he was not so backward in his support of the federal Constitution and government as some of his political associates were. Contending for powers of the states, which had not been clearly delegated to Congress, he also kept in mind the authority that had been conceded to the nation. We shall best support the federal system by maintaining the Constitution and government of our own state. The federal government must stand or fall with the state governments. If the federal government absorbs the powers of the state governments, it will become a different system from what it was intended. To maintain it, as it now is, will be best effected by preserving the state governments in all their just authority. Yet it was hard to look beyond his own province, notwithstanding whatever broadening influences he might have met in his terms in Congress. Much that he heard there was of states' rights, and little of their obligations or concessions. It is not strange, therefore, that his federal sympathies, though broad for his day, were subordinate to his sense of the prerogatives of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and by consequence of the other commonwealths. The nation was to be built upon 13 separate and distinct pillars. It might hold them together, it must not fuse them into one pillar. In one respect, a new cause of difference and alienation was already beginning to arise and to emphasize the doctrine of states' rights as opposed to national uniformity. It began in Massachusetts when African slavery was abolished at the adoption of its Constitution. All the colonies had been encouraged by the home government to pursue the profitable trade in rum for Negroes on the Guinea coast. Royal governors were instructed to negative bills passed by legislatures for the suppression of this trade, in which the nobility and the king himself had a profitable interest. Still, despite court example and control, the colonial conscience was uneasy in the North and frequently in the South, and strong protests were uttered by leading statesmen. The unprofitableness of the system was everywhere notorious, and might have ultimately destroyed it had not the invention of the cotton gin increased the profits of slave labor marvelously, and in consequence mightily reinforced Southern sentiment in favor of perpetuating it. Northern states, one after another, followed the example of Massachusetts until, on a question which eventually would broaden into a wide gulf between the two sections, the difference of opinion was already beginning to divide the colonies into two groups, and even communities and families in each. Hancock did not become blind to the evil of slavery, as some of his successors did through familiarity with its sunny side. He had as keen a sense as some early Southern statesmen had of the cancerous germ which the fathers knew they were leaving in the Constitution, hoping that it would disappear with the growth of the nation. But Massachusetts did not wait for it to die, but in Hancock's administration, and with his recommendation and endorsement, continued a reform which, if it had been universally effected, would have saved the nation from the dire calamity of civil war 80 years afterward. In minor ethics, he was equally conscientious, sometimes surpassing his associates. Notwithstanding the relief afforded by the federal government in assuming states' debts, the taxes in Massachusetts were high, and with unpaid accumulations from former years to be provided for. Governor Hancock's policy of forbearance in the early 80s had doubtless saved the state from despair, if not from anarchy. But when the proposed sale of Maine lands for relief was abandoned as a failure, the legislature consented to a lottery for the purpose of raising money for the necessities of the state in a time when even religious societies held left hands behind them for aid through such doubtful expedients. The governor wisely and firmly disapproved of descending to enlist gambling methods for upholding the credit of the Commonwealth, and the legislature soon came to be convinced of the impolicy of the scheme. In what was then regarded by many as an equally unbecoming matter, he displayed even greater zeal, an inheritance from a Puritan past, which one would hardly look for in the society leader on Beacon Hill. An old law enacted against theaters stood on the statute book, enacted in imitation of Cromwell's ordinance of 1642, annulled in England 14 years later. Yet in Massachusetts, players appeared on the stage at the risk of arrest. In 1791, sundry respectable citizens of Boston made efforts to get this old statute repealed, urging that it would be easy to select harmless plays for a literary and elegant entertainment, but other inhabitants of equally high standing protested. On one December evening, a moral lecture, entitled the true-born Irishman, was advertised to follow feats on the tightrope at the New England Exhibition Room board alley. There was also a commendable attempt to introduce the classic drama into the modern Athens. An unlooked-for feature was presented when the sheriff of Suffolk County unceremoniously stepped forth on the stage in the scene of Bosworth Field in Richard III and made prisoner the humpback tyrant, threatening also to arrest the entire company unless the performance ceased forthwith. Endicott had come back to Boston. Loud calls to proceed with the play were useless with Richard in the sheriff's hands. Governor Hancock's portrait had been hung in front of the stage box, possibly as a sop to Cerberus. In a twinkling it fell under the feet of disappointed playgoers, and the handsome visage was disfigured beyond that of the original Richard himself. At the examination of this worthy's representative in Faneuil Hall, the Attorney General read a special order for his arrest from Governor Hancock. Harrison Gray Otis defended the king, objecting to the legality of the warrant, issued as it was without complaint being made upon oath. The justices acceded, and the prisoner was discharged. His name was Harper, a proto-martyr to the dramatic art, whose interruption and detention made for the abolition of an unpopular statute on the last day of 1792. A building for stage plays was soon after erected on Federal Street. Another law, enacted in the Puritan age and rigorously enforced for the observance of the Lord's Day, was also revived in Hancock's administration. War, as usual, had been followed by a laxity in this respect, and legislation was invoked to restore in a measure former strictures of observance. The new law was not so severe in its penalties as the old, nor in its provisions, as, for instance, that there should be no osculatory greetings in families on that day, but it did forbid traveling for business or pleasure, and all recreation. Perhaps the governor, in approving this enactment, recalled his own arrest one Sunday in a former year for taking a turn on the common as he was coming from church. It was too late to bring back the Hebraic code of the preceding century, and prohibition in this instance, as in others, did not prevent a growing license. Traditional respect was stronger than statutes, and in the main Sunday was well observed for 3/4 of a century, until a greater war entailed greater looseness of observance, to which certain well-known diversions have contributed. For his own deliberate and unhasting age, Hancock had not led a sluggish existence, and his labors and his mode of living together had been sapping a not overstrong constitution before he had rounded out half a century. He had not been without his troubles and sorrows. The infant daughter had died, as had been mentioned, in her first summer, and in 1787 the son in his 9th year met with a fatal accident while skating. Then there was always the customary amount of political criticism, to which Hancock might have been less sensitive than a less generally approved man, provided it were not as blunt as this. J.H., the first magistrate, who is acquainted with no branch of science at all, not even government, in which he should have been fit for the station he unworthily occupies. And Reverend Dr. William Gordon, pastor of a church to which Hancock had made many gifts, so sharply criticized his benefactor that the governor gave up his summer residence in Jamaica Plain. Since his resumption of the governorship in 1788, his health had declined. Still, he kept up a brave fight in a critical time for the principles which he deemed vital to the welfare of the Commonwealth. His last public efforts were for the defense of its sovereignty, and his final appearance as chief magistrate was before the legislature in the afternoon of September 8, 1793, in the old State House, whither he was brought attended by Secretary Avery and Sheriff Allen. On taking his official chair, he informed the assembly that his infirm health would not permit him to address them personally, and he begged them to be seated while the Secretary of State read his address, as it would be impossible for him to speak so as to be heard. He had summoned a special session of the General Court to consider a suit at law which had been instituted in the federal court by one vassal, an alien, against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The governor and the attorney general, as the principal citizens of the state, had received a summons as defendants. The first question to be decided was with regard to the suability of a sovereign state. In his message, the governor had given it as his opinion that the state could not be compelled to answer to a civil suit, as it would be utterly incompatible with its sovereignty. He could not conceive, when the Constitution was adopted, that it was expected by the people that a state should be held to answer on compulsory civil process to any individual. The subject was discussed for several days, when a vote was passed, 107 to 19, supporting the opinion of the governor, in these words: Resolved, that a power claimed of compelling a state to become a defendant in a court of the United States at the suit of an individual or individuals is unnecessary and inexpedient, and in its exercise dangerous to the peace, safety, and independence of the several states, and repugnant to the first principles of a federal government. The state delegates in Congress were instructed to obtain an amendment to the Constitution embodying the sense of the above resolution. In consequence, an article was soon added denying the authority of a United States court to oblige a state to answer before it to the civil suit of citizens of another state. It was a bold measure, but in accord with the sentiments of a people who had not fully adopted the idea of a national or consolidated government. The entire action bordered on a refusal to obey its authority when as yet an appeal to the states for their concurrence had not been made. State sovereignty was still in the governor's mind, and his last fight was for its maintenance, in which he achieved a greater success for Massachusetts and all the states than he lived to see. When the secretary had finished reading the address to the legislature, the governor added, I rely upon your candor to pardon this mode of addressing you. I feel the seeds of mortality growing fast within me. But I think I have, in this case, done no more than my duty as a servant of the people. I never did, and I never will deceive them while I have life and strength to act in their service. The assembly arose as the governor was conveyed to his carriage and taken home, never again to appear in public. He died 3 weeks later of gout and exhaustion, October 8, 1793, in the 57th year of his age. For a week, citizens from all parts of the state came by thousands to pay tributes of respect to his memory. On the 16th, a procession a mile and a half long followed the body to the Granary burying ground. A funeral escort under command of Brigadier General Hull consisted of officers of the militia, justices of the peace, judges of probate, the Attorney General, justices of the Supreme Court, members of the legislature and council, and the lieutenant governor. 6 of the oldest councilors were the pallbearers. After these followed relatives, the Vice President of the United States, and members of Congress, judges and secretaries, former councilors and senators of Massachusetts, the president, corporation, and professors of Harvard College, selectmen and town clerk of Boston, with other town officers, clergymen, members of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, a committee of the Brattle Street Church, of which the deceased had been a member. Citizens and visitors completed the procession, which moved from the mansion house of the late governor across the Common and down Frog Lane, now Boylston Street, to Liberty Pole, through the main street and round the State House, up Court Street, and from thence to the place of interment. A conspicuous person in this procession was Samuel Adams, who was obliged to withdraw from it at State Street on account of failing strength. When the General Court assembled in the following January, he opened his address as Lieutenant Governor with these words: It having pleased the Supreme Being, since your last meeting, in his holy providence, to remove from this transitory life our late excellent Governor Hancock, the multitude of his surviving fellow citizens, who have often given strong testimonials of their approbation of his important services, while they drop a tear, may certainly profit by the recollection of his virtuous and patriotic example. With this moderate eulogy, he proceeded to the affairs before the legislature. The Reverend Dr. Thatcher, Hancock's pastor, preached a sermon with fuller appreciation on the 29th of October in the Brattle Street Church, 3 weeks after the governor's death. It has peculiar value as testimony to the character of the subject, coming as it did from an intimate associate in the affairs of the parish and the town, and based upon general opinion as well as his own. After the custom of the time, and as in his memorial discourses in the instances of Governors Baudouin and Samuel Adams, the sermon is so long as to forbid entire quotation. Disconnected sentences must stand for the sentiments of the whole. It is difficult to draw the character of a man in a station so elevated without being charged with partiality, and with a disposition to flatter the dead or gratify the living. But think not that I shall attempt to describe this great man as a character absolutely perfect, for perfection is not the lot of humanity, and to ascribe it to the best of men must prove a want of sincerity or knowledge. Let his failings, for which charity will furnish many apologies, be buried with him. Governor Hancock was formed by nature to act a brilliant part in the world. His abilities were of the kind which strike, astonish, and please. They were highly respectable and were cultivated by education, travel, and the conversation of safe and good men. Coming into possession of a fortune superior to any which our part of America had then known, his friends viewed him with anxiety. They feared that he would be drawn into the vortex of dissipation. They were pleased when they found him taking a different turn, wishing to acquire the esteem and confidence of men of character, and appearing as the friend and asserter of the liberties of his country. His patriotism and his amiable popular manners rendered him the idol of his fellow citizens. They loved his very name, and early showered upon him their best honors. No man before him ever possessed such a command of their affections. They loved him because he espoused their cause and aimed at their interest. His name and influence were of the highest importance to the common cause. He was eloquent and spoke with ease and propriety. His manners were graceful, and he had a peculiar talent of presiding with dignity at the head of a deliberative body. Every individual supposed himself to be particularly noticed and favored. When, at his own request, he was released from the fatigues of Congress, he was received with former affection and experienced former confidence by the people of Massachusetts when they called him to be the first governor under our present Constitution. Such distinction is seldom placed in the same man, but Mr. Hancock never lost the popular affection. He was also a firm friend to the independence and happiness of united America. He gave his decided influence in favor of the federal Constitution, and did then perhaps as much service to his country as when he consented to its independence. To this may be added his munificence. Perhaps there is not a person in America who has done more generous and noble actions or contributed more liberally to public institutions. His acts of charity of a more private nature were numerous and constant. The poor, the widow, the fatherless, the unhappy debtor, the prisoner, the decayed gentleman, all experienced his bounty. The sums which he gave away would scarcely be credited. His reverence for religion was never lost. He was interested in everything that related to the house of God. He exceeded his worthy ancestors in his liberality to this society, and proved his real attachment to our peace and happiness. It might have been said of him, as of the centurion by the Jews, "He loved our nation, and hath built us a synagogue." It is on record that the expenses of the governor's funeral were not paid by the state, but from the estate of the chief magistrate himself, who, unlike the Commonwealth, was not burdened with debts, although his fortune had been greatly impaired by the stringency of the time. 100 years after his death, the legislature of Massachusetts, on February 3, 1894, coming to a sense of the obscurity in which John Hancock had lain for a century, passed this resolution: Resolved, that there be allowed and paid out of the treasury of the Commonwealth a sum not exceeding $3,000 to be expended under the direction of the Governor and Council for the purpose of erecting a suitable memorial over the grave of Governor John Hancock in the Granary Burying Ground in Boston. When the monument was placed, a service of dedication was held on September 10, 1896. the shaft being unveiled by a great-grand-niece, Miss Mary Elizabeth Wood, as there was no direct descendant of John Hancock. On account of the rain that afternoon, the service was continued in the Park Street Church, at which Governor Wolcott said, "It has long been a matter of comment, and possibly of regret to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that the grave of her first governor, a man who played so large a part in the Revolutionary period, remained in the heart of the principal city of the Commonwealth unmarked by any enduring monument. It will be one of those spots to which the feet of pilgrims will be directed. It will be one of the memories which those who visit us from other states or other countries will bear away with them from historic Boston and historic Massachusetts, and as the hurrying crowd passes by the sidewalk, I hope that it will speak eloquently for all years to come of patriotic and loyal service to the Commonwealth." In his speech accepting the monument in behalf of the state, he said, "As we look back upon that period of the Revolution, to the events that led up to it, there is one figure, among others, that stands with peculiar significance to the public mind. That figure is John Hancock, a man of dignity of presence, fond of elaborate ceremonial, elegant in his attire, courtly in his manner, a man of education and great wealth for that time, and a man who threw himself heart and soul into the patriotic duties of the hour. I think we especially connect his name and memory with three acts. In the first place, we remember that in the proclamation of amnesty there were two names accepted. One was that of John Hancock, the other that of Samuel Adams. We remember that when Paul Revere rode out into Middlesex County to warn the farmers of the approach of British troops, John Hancock and Samuel Adams were slumbering quietly in the little village of Lexington, and that their capture was accounted as important to the British cause as the capture or destruction of the ammunition which they were sent out to seize. We especially remember John Hancock again as President of the Continental Congress, and as the first to sign, in his bold, fine signature, his name to that immortal declaration in which those who signed it pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause of liberty. Of Mrs. Hancock it remains to be said that on July 28, 1796, she married Captain James Scott, who was a trusted shipmaster long in the employ of her first husband. She outlived the second many years, residing for a time at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and afterward at No. 4 Federal Street, Boston, where her hospitality was enlivened by her remarkable memory and brilliant conversation. When Lafayette was in the country in 1825, they recalled together the scenes of 50 years before, when in younger days they could not foresee the fulfillment of their hopes. She could recollect the personal appearance and manners of British officers quartered in Boston, of whom Earl Percy seems to have made the most favorable impression, since, accustomed to the luxuries of Warkworth Castle, his Northumberland home, he slept among his troops in a tent on the Common during the winter of 1774-5, and drilled the regulars at dawn not far from the Hancock mansion. He did not advance far enough toward Lexington on the next 19th of April, when he covered the disastrous retreat, for Dorothy Quincy to catch one more glimpse of him before she was withdrawn from all further visual admiration of the fascinating Earl to Connecticut Fairfield and the equally attractive Aaron Burr. It is not strange that Hancock had his hours of solicitude in his lodgings at Philadelphia until the August wedding day. On her part, it seems to have been an instance of love after marriage. When in old age she was complimented on her good looks, she would laughingly reply, "What you say is more than 100 years old. My ears remember it, but what were dimples once are wrinkles now." To the end, however, she was as attentive to her attire as in early years, and had no patience with a young girl who did not dress to please, nor with one who was vain of her clothes. Madam Scott died in Boston on February 3, 1830, in her 84th year. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of John Hancock, The Picturesque Patriot by Lorenzo Sears. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An estimate. In asking what place John Hancock occupied in his day and what values he represents in American history, two factors must be considered which determine the character, conduct, and achievement of men of distinction who are not geniuses and therefore to be accounted for by their heredity and environment. Whatever value is attached to the doctrine of heredity, it will be allowed that inheritances of disposition from progenitors are a large part of the capital with which a child starts in life. In this instance, a reputed descent from remote ancestors in Ireland has been claimed, and the possible persistence of sundry Celtic traits is illustrated by well-known characteristics. These, however, had lived on amidst the chilly influences of the Puritan age until they were stiffened into habits and principles unlike their original form and spirit. A love of leadership, for instance, had hardened into a grandfather's dominating temper, to be softened in the grandson into a harmless desire to be foremost in the procession with the notoriety that kind of precedence bestows. Sometimes the professional accretion of an overlord spirit from the period of a magisterial ministry cropped out when circumstances favored, but there was no desperate fight to win and keep preeminence, such as Samuel Adams maintained until his main purpose was accomplished. Still, Hancock had no faculty of keeping in the background, such as the retiring but able Hawley had, a man who would have outrun all radicals if a native modesty and a singular disposition had not marred his efficiency. No self-deprecation restrained Hancock when his services or presence were needed. If modesty is a fault, as some hold, he was blameless in that respect. If generous appreciation of oneself is a helpful quality in the daily struggle, he found this gift a sustaining power in a time when every ally was needed. Confidence in himself gave him good hope for the cause which had him for one of its foremost champions. Because he himself had espoused it, there was no question in his mind of its worthiness. The right would prevail eventually, and no later on account of his own attitude towards it. Such conscientiousness affords great comfort to its possessor, and moreover radiates abundant cheer in a time when uncertainty and doubt, misgiving and fear prevail. Courage, determination, and zeal accomplish wonders, but an added assurance and a confident front are often the stay of those who look to their leaders to do their thinking and to their watchmen to tell them of the night and of the morning. If half the victory is in believing that it can be won, there is always someone to win the other half. But Hancock was not all conceit. It is the habit of his detractors to put uppermost this amusing but harmless and sometimes useful defect, thus overclouding his sterling qualities. Because he was vain, he could therefore be nothing else, is poor logic. As well say, because he was handsome, he had no courage, generosity, and sympathy, or because he loved official station, therefore he was not an admirable occupant of it. Let his well-known kindness to the poor and his benevolence to the public refute the first supposition, and repeated re-elections deny the second. Instead, his generous gifts overbalanced whatever publicity they unavoidably gained in a time when the left hand could not fail to know what the right hand did, especially when both were extended in benefaction. To the $100,000 which it is estimated he contributed or sacrificed to the cause of liberty might be added an unstinted hospitality toward all classes in several ways, often in the name and to the honor of the town of which he was a citizen. To the churches he was equally well disposed, as in the gift of £1,000 sterling to the building of the Brattle Street Church, of which he was a member, with the addition of pulpit furniture and a bell, also of similar gifts at Jamaica Plain, his summer resort. To the poor he gave freely, especially in a time of distress when want was at every door where there was not a competence within. His patriotism is so often assumed to be a matter of course, and as something which should belong to all Americans, that it is not always remembered what an unusual and exceptional occurrence it was for a prominent citizen of Boston to join the movement against the established government in the beginning of the revolt. Its early promoters from the docks, shops, and shipyards, who had not much to lose, did not attract many substantial merchants, salaried judges, and government officials who were content to let well enough alone and who considered the outcome as exceedingly uncertain long after the war broke out. Nor does it so much matter by what persuasions Hancock was induced to throw himself into the movement at first, as that he did it in the face of considerations which kept most of his circle out of it at the time. If no aristocrat had joined the laboring classes, whose majority Samuel Adams was swelling by speeches, newspaper articles, and oftener by personal talk, the cause would have received heartier support. The surprise of great houses on the hillsides and of their heads at the Royal Exchange must have been genuine when the richest man of them all broke away from the ingrained and inherited loyalty of 150 years to join the discontented rabble, always ready for any change, and easily led by the man who dares, having only his voice to contribute to the cause. Hancock and his neighbors had warehouses and foreign trade, respectability and social standing, with the stability and prosperity of the existing order and the conservatism natural to the English race, with its divine right of grumbling at present evils and its dogged pertinacity in keeping them sacred up to the point of explosion. The best in Boston did not admit that they had reached that point even after Gage invested the town. Those who have a century and a third of independence behind them cannot easily understand such devotion to British authority in all matters, but they who had a century and a half of home government back of them, and 1,000 years of its traditions beyond that, could not comprehend that the untried new would be better than the old with all the faults they had condoned or been half proud of. The new king was arbitrary without doubt, but his best men were not, and they were slowly warping the Hanoverian hulk into the current again. If British generals and admirals would show pluck enough to suppress rope spinners, ship carpenters, and shopmen, and have wit enough to catch Sam Adams and get Hancock made a peer of the realm, time and mortality would adjust all temporary ills, and prosperity would return with ships from every port. So reasoned the aristocrats of Boston. Hancock's defection from the coterie of merchant princes and their policy was unaccountable to them. What could radical rebels promise him besides the companionship that misery loves? This was the talk of the majority in the lordly mansions which looked out on the harbor from the garden slopes that faced it. Hancock himself had been familiar with loyal sentiments in his uncle's house. Was he so distressed by imposts and navigation acts beyond all others that he would better his trade by rebellion, for it was secure commercial justice rather than freedom which started the Revolution? It is commonly said that Sam Adams held up before him such likelihood of preferment in the new order that Hancock was induced to risk everything for its rewards. This supposition became more plausible after these emoluments had been bestowed upon him than it was in the year when Adams is said to have pictured an attractive future for a man whose prominence would lend assistance to the cause. If Hancock had political ambitions, Governor Hutchinson could have pointed out a shorter road to distinction and a much surer and safer one. What had Adams to promise in 1775 beyond the chairmanship of a radical club and later of a disputing legislature and a discordant Congress? These honors were the best the country could bestow, to be sure, after the command of its troops, but John Hancock was too wise a tradesman to sell his commercial interests, his fortune, and his favor at court for these uncertain compensations alone. Suppose that his course could be matched to another theory, that having seen the condition of the middle and lower classes in England under a limited monarchy, and being sensible of the contrast between the freedom of American colonialists and the subjection of home-born Britons, he should resent encroachments upon long-enjoyed privileges, fearing their diminution and any approach to the conditions in which the English commonalty passed its stolid existence. Moreover, he might equally deplore an arbitrary assertion of the right to lay burdens upon colonials which had not been imposed hitherto, and to depreciate the compensatory privilege of indirect representation in the legislative body, unlike that direct method to which the colonies had been accustomed. They were also under the general charge of unfairness and despotic treatment specific allegations, such as were afterward incorporated into the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. In an historical novel relating to the Revolutionary period, the writer has placed the statement of these grievances to the credit of Hancock rather than of Adams or any other precursor of Jefferson. A little of the context may help illume the feature of political club doings in Boston town in uneasy times. The title hero, Cardigan, is present at the Wild Goose Club of Minutemen captains when a fashionably dressed young man approached our table. His style of dress was not to my taste. An apple green coat, white silk stockings, silver buckles, and much expensive lace at his throat and cuffs. Everybody had now taken chairs and formed a semicircle around Mr. Hancock, who leaned against the great center table and said, "I am here to submit to you a list of crimes against our colony of Massachusetts Bay, committed or contemplated by the King of England. He refuses his assent to laws and measures for the public good, forbids the passage of laws unless suspended in their operation till his assent be obtained, calls together legislative bodies at unusual places to discourage attendance, dissolves assemblies for opposing his invasion of people's rights and obstructs the administration of justice, makes judges dependent upon his will alone for tenure of office and salaries, creates new offices to be filled by his appointments, keeps a standing army here in a time of peace independent of civil power, protects its troops from punishment for murder, cuts off our trade with the whole world, taxes us without our consent, deprives us of trial by jury, transports us for trial, takes away our charters, abolishes our laws, and suspends our legislatures." Hancock looked up, holding the paper unrolled. "Why," he said lightly, "this is no king, but Caesar among his praetorians." Then, with a brief inclination, he turned and left the room. It was not an orator's effort that Hancock had accomplished. It was a mere statement of the truth, yet so skillfully timed and so dramatic in execution that it was worth months of oratory before the vast audiences of Faneuil Hall. The author of this imaginary scene warns readers in his preface against taking the novel for history. Yet, like good fiction of the kind, it is as valuable for illustration as some histories that have been written. His portrait of Hancock is as characteristic as some that have been made of him in the colors. The charges against the king, which the author puts into the patriot's mouth, such as Jefferson afterward penned, were commonplaces of daily utterance and were more likely to be spoken by Hancock and Adams than any other leading citizens of Boston, Otis perhaps excepted. They were allegations which ought to have moved all the aristocrats of the town to follow the chief of them in revolt against the stubborn tyranny of George III. To this portraiture by the novelist, the following personal note by a contemporary may be added. He will be considered in the history of our country as one of the greatest men of his age. How true this may be, distant generations are not likely to know. He was sent as a delegate to Congress in 1774, and in consequence of his personal deportment and his fame as a patriot, he was elevated, in an assembly of eminent men, to the dignity of president, which office he held when the Declaration was signed, at which time he was only 39 years of age. In June 1782, Hancock had the appearance of advanced age, though only 45. He had been repeatedly and severely afflicted with the gout, a disease much more common in those days than it is now, while dyspepsia, if it existed at all, was not known by that name. As recollected, at this time Mr. Hancock was nearly 6 feet in stature and of slender person, stooping a little and apparently enfeebled by disease. His manners were very gracious, of the old style of dignified complaisance. His face had been very handsome. Dress was adapted quite as much to be ornamental as useful. Gentlemen wore wigs when abroad, and, commonly, caps when at home. At this time, June 1782, about noon, Hancock was dressed in a red velvet cap, within which was one of fine linen. The latter was turned up over the lower edge of the velvet one 2 or 3 inches. He wore a blue damask gown lined with silk, a white stock, a white satin embroidered waistcoat, black satin smallclothes, white silk stockings, and red morocco slippers. It was a general practice in the genteel families to have a tankard of punch made in the morning and placed in a cooler when the season required it. Visitors were invited to partake of it. At this visit, Hancock took from the cooler, standing on the hearth, a full tankard, and drank first himself, and then offered it to those present. Hancock was hospitable. There might have been seen at his table all classes, from grave and dignified clergymen down to the gifted in song, narration, anecdote, and wit, with whom noiseless falls the foot of time that only treads on flowers. Though Hancock was very wealthy, he was too much occupied with public affairs to be advantageously attentive to his private. The times in which he lived, and the distinguished agency which fell to his lot from his sincere and ardent devotion to the patriot cause, engendered a strong self-regard. He was said to be somewhat sensitive, easily offended, and very uneasy in the absence of the high consideration which he claimed, rather as a right than a courtesy. He had strong personal friends, and equally strong personal enemies. From such causes arose some irritating difficulties. He had not only a commanding deportment, which he could qualify with a most attractive amenity, but a fine voice and a highly graceful manner. These were traits which distinguished him from most men, and qualified him to preside in popular assemblies with great dignity. He was not supposed to be a man of great intellectual force by nature, and his early engagements in political life, and as the scenes in which he was conversant called for the exercise of his powers only in the public service, he was so placed as not to have had occasion to display the force of his mind in that service, so as to enable those of the present day to judge of it, excepting in his communications as governor of Massachusetts to the legislature. If history has any proper concern with the individual qualities of Hancock, it may be doubtful whether, in these respects, distant generations will know exactly what manner of man he was. But as a public man, his country is greatly indebted to him. He was most faithfully devoted to her cause, and it is a high eulogy on his patriotism that when the British government offered pardons to all the rebels for all their offenses, Hancock and Samuel Adams were the only persons to whom this grace was denied. Suppose that Hancock had been one of the small shopkeepers on the side streets of the town, perhaps as unsuccessful in business as Samuel Adams was, but had felt the injustice of British rule as some Britons saw it, and that he had joined in the early remonstrances against it. No charge of what he was likely to gain would have been urged to account for his patriotism. It is possible that he could discern the evils of the time as clearly as the wayside tradesman who had little to lose, and that his regard for the general profit under a popular government would be as great as a grocer's or a cobbler's. His large business and great wealth naturally stood in the way of revolutionary ideas, with their inevitable disturbance of trade and finance and the worse conditions which might follow colonial failure in a doubtful contest. It is, therefore, to his greater credit that, despite naturally opposing considerations, he was willing to risk everything for the possibility of the country's freedom to work out its own prosperity amidst its abundant resources. It would be easier for a biographer to place Hancock where he deservedly belongs if he could say that he was not rich or ostentatious or vain. On the other hand, if these qualifications to perfection made it hard for his class to enter into the new kingdom, additional esteem should be awarded a man who could ally himself with a doubtful but noble cause which promised more for future generations than his own. If the possibility of patriotism existing together with wealth and social position be looked for, and in spite of the probable loss of such advantages, abundant examples can be found in the history of the nation. In Boston, one instance in particular will occur to those who recall what Wendell Phillips sacrificed to the little band of nobodies at the outset of the crusade against an evil which early statesmen deplored but failed to extirpate from the Constitution and the nation. From time to time, there will be men whose sense of wrong and vision of right will be greater than of the chance surroundings of wealth or the uncertain prospect of ambitions as doubtful as were those of any conspicuous patriot before the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. Comparatively great as were the rewards which were thrust upon the man who of all revolutionists had the most to lose, the compensation did not equal what he risked, unless what he valued most to be counted, the vision of a free republic under a constitutional government which he was permitted to behold before his death. While, therefore, we may smile with his contemporaries at his harmless love of display and of official position, we may remember also that there was a generous side in his almost indiscriminate hospitality, and in his sacrifice of time and money for the public weal. If he was vain, it will be admitted that vanity is a common weakness with different location in one and another, visible and invisible, and, moreover, that there were many provocatives to self-complacency and numerous sycophants to feed and encourage it. If he was not a great statesman, he at least had the tact and patience to manage a discordant assembly and to keep them free from initial disunion, and therefore from eventual relapse into a worse subjection than at first, and to bring them on a part of the way toward the beginnings of confederacy, itself to end in union. If John Hancock had not lived, and had not been the man for a trying position in a critical time, if he had not given to a democratic enterprise the aristocratic following of himself and a few friends who were influenced by his example, thus furnishing a tone at which democracy pretends to scoff, but inwardly is glad to have as an ally, as well as the funds that usually accompany respectability, if these adventitious elements had not been at the service of a reactionary cause in the rebellious town of Boston first, and throughout the land afterward, success might possibly have followed in time and through other men. But at that day it seemed, and even now seems, that another fate awaited disagreeing, half-hearted patriots, such as might have befallen them if there had been no Robert Morris behind the treasury and no George Washington at the head of the army. Therefore, as the shrewd financier had a talent for the business side of war, and as the other had a genius for military science beneath all the imperfections that hypercritical historians have discovered, so let it be admitted that underneath the purple and fine linen, and despite his chariot and six, John Hancock had a true-hearted devotion to liberty, inspiring a diligent, wise, and sincere service of his country for its needful union, eventual independence, and ultimate prosperity. End of Chapter 20. End of John Hancock, The Picturesque Patriot, by Lorenzo Sears.